The brass door handle of the black sedan was cold on a surprisingly warm September afternoon. The only warm spot was a tiny, perfect circle right in the center, a ghost of a thumbprint left by the driver, Leo. Elena stared at that small, warm spot while her husband, Mikhail, shouted into his phone inside their 10,000-square-foot home in McLean, Virginia. His voice was a muffled, angry rumble from 30 feet away, but it felt like it was right in her ear. Elena stood perfectly still on the wide, white veranda. Her job, she had learned over the last 3 years of marriage, was to be a beautiful, silent statue. Today, her statue outfit was a cream-colored linen dress that cost more than a month's rent on her old apartment. She held a glass of iced tea she didn't want. The ice had melted into little half-moon shapes, clicking softly against the crystal. Down on the circular driveway, Leo stood by the car. He was new. He'd started just 3 weeks ago, on the 7th of September. He was always like this, still, professional, his eyes hidden behind sunglasses, his driver's uniform crisp and dark against the gleaming black paint of the Mercedes. He looked like he was carved from the same material as the car itself. He never looked at her. Not really. He looked at the gates, at the dashboard, at the horizon. It was a specific kind of not looking that felt heavier than any stare. Mikhail's voice cut off. A moment later, the heavy oak front door clicked shut. Elena didn't jump, but her fingers tightened on the cold glass. Mikhail walked toward her, his Italian loafers making no sound on the stone. He was smiling his public smile, the one that didn't touch his eyes, which were the color of winter slate. "Ready, my dear?" he asked, his voice now smooth as honey. He placed a hand on the small of her back. It wasn't a caress. It was a placement, a direction. "Of course," Elena said, her voice as light as she could make it. The drive was always silent. Mikhail would work, his fingers tapping on his tablet, or he'd make calls in a language Elena had tried and failed to learn. She would watch Virginia blur past the tinted windows, the tall, proud oaks, the red brick walls of other enormous homes, the glimpses of the Potomac River, gray and wide. Tonight's event was a charity gala for a children's hospital at the historic Mayflower Hotel in Washington, D.C. It was one of dozens they attended each year. Her role was simple: smile, stand beside him, and look impressed. She was very good at her role. Inside the hotel ballroom, everything was gold and crystal and the low, expensive hum of conversation. The air smelled like gardenias from the huge centerpieces and faintly of old money. Elena held Mikhail's arm, her hand resting lightly on the rough, dark wool of his tuxedo jacket. That's when it happened. They were gliding through the crowd when Mikhail's entire body went stiff. Just for a second, Elena followed his line of sight and saw a man, maybe in his 50s, with a head of silver hair and a hearty laugh, talking to a small group. A United States senator. Mikhail's hand, which had been resting over hers on his arm, suddenly clamped down. His grip was so tight it pinched the skin on her fingers. Without a word, he pivoted, steering her sharply away, using his own body as a barrier between her and the senator's group. Her silk gown whispered against his legs as he pulled her into the shadow of a massive floral arrangement. He leaned in, his lips brushing her ear. His breath smelled of expensive cognac and mint. His whisper was a cold, sharp blade. "Eyes forward, Ducha Moya. My soul." He always called her that when he was most angry. It never felt like an endearment. It felt like a claim. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird in a gilded cage. She kept her smile painted on. "Yes, Mikhail." For the rest of the night, she saw nothing but the glitter of chandeliers and the blur of faces. But she felt everything, the lingering ache in her fingers, the weight of the rule he had just reinforced. "You see only what I allow you to see." It was nearing midnight when they left. The grand clock in the hotel lobby had just finished its deep, bronze chiming. The city air outside was cooler now, a relief after the stuffy ballroom. Leo had the car waiting perfectly under the awning. He opened the door for Mikhail, then for her. As she slid in, she caught a glimpse of him. His sunglasses were off now. His eyes, in the flash of the hotel lights, were a warm, quiet brown. They didn't meet hers. They looked past her, at his employer, confirming the route. But for 1/2 second, his expression wasn't blank. It was calm. It was the look of someone standing on solid ground while everyone else was on a tilting ship. And then it was gone, and he was just the driver again. The drive back to Virginia was dark and quiet. Mikhail was asleep, or pretending to be, his head leaning back against the headrest. Elena watched the streetlights streak by, each one a lonely yellow eye winking out as they passed. They were on the George Washington Memorial Parkway, the Potomac of vast black emptiness to their right, when the world exploded. It wasn't an explosion. It was a bang so loud and sudden it felt like one. The car jerked violently to the right. A horrible, grinding roar vibrated up through the seats. Elena was thrown against her seatbelt, the strap digging hard into her collarbone. Mikhail was instantly awake, cursing in Russian. "Leo? What was that?" "Blown tire, sir." Leo's voice came from the front, steady and clear. "Passenger rear. I need to pull over." He guided the shuddering car onto a narrow, tree-lined shoulder. No streetlights here. The only light came from the moon and the car's own interior bulbs. Outside, the woods were deep and dark. The engine cut off, and a thick, heavy silence fell, broken only by the ticking of the cooling metal and Mikhail's angry sigh. "Well, fix it," Mikhail snapped. He didn't move to get out. He pulled out his phone, the blue glow lighting his face, and began making a call, his voice sharp with irritation. Leo got out without a word. Elena watched him through the rain-streaked window. A light, misting rain had begun to fall, making the world look soft and smeared. Leo went to the trunk, his movements efficient and unhurried. He pulled out a jack, a wrench, and the spare tire. What happened next felt like a secret show, just for her. Mikhail was ranting on the phone about incompetence and delays. But outside, Leo worked. He knelt on the wet asphalt. The mist settled in his dark hair like tiny diamonds. He fit the wrench onto the lug nuts, and his back and shoulders shifted under the now damp fabric of his uniform jacket. There was a strength there, a sure, quiet capability that was the opposite of Mikhail's loud, demanding power. He loosened the nuts, placed the jack, and raised the car. The rain picked up a little, and he didn't seem to notice. He pulled the ruined tire off. It was then, as he rolled the flat tire aside, that a spray of muddy water from the wheel well arced through the air. It hit the side of the car door, asterisk her asterisk door, with a wet, heavy thud. The sound made her flinch, and Leo looked up. He didn't look at Mikhail, lost in his phone call. He didn't look at the woods or the road. He turned his head and looked directly at the tinted window where Elena sat. He couldn't see her. She knew that. The tint was too dark from the outside. But he looked anyway. His face was calm, streaked with rain. He looked at the spot where she was, held his gaze for one breath, two, as if acknowledging the person hidden in the dark, silent capsule. Then he bent back to his work, heaving the spare tire into place. Inside the car, Elena's breath fogged a tiny circle on the glass. Her heart, which had been pounding from the shock of the blowout, was now beating for a completely different reason. It wasn't fear. It was the shock of being seen, even when she was invisible. Mikhail ended his call. "Useless," he muttered, not specifying who. A few minutes later, Leo's face appeared at Mikhail's window. "All set, sir. We can proceed." The car started, smooth and quiet once more. As they pulled back onto the parkway, Elena kept her face turned toward her own window. But in the reflection, she watched the quiet man in the driver's seat. He had looked. Why had he looked? The rest of the drive was silent. But everything had changed. The hairline crack in her perfectly arranged life wasn't just a crack anymore. It was a window. And for the first time in a very long time, Elena found herself wanting to look out. The flat tire on the parkway was a week ago, but it didn't feel like it was in the past. For Elena, it felt like something that was still happening, a quiet earthquake with aftershocks she kept feeling in her chest. The memory of Leo looking at the window played over and over in her mind, a short, silent film on a loop. She found herself noticing things now. The way the morning light hit the grand staircase at 7:15 a.m. The specific pattern of cracks in the old stone bird bath in the garden that looked like a tiny map. And she noticed Leo. The precise angle of his cap. The way he held the car door, his hand in a black leather glove. He was still a statue, but she had learned he breathed. It was a Tuesday, the last day of September. Mikhail was away on a business trip to Chicago. The house felt different when he was gone. It was still enormous and quiet, but the quiet was peaceful, not heavy. It was a library instead of a tomb. Elena had spent the day in the sunroom, actually reading a book, a novel about people sailing around the world, instead of just holding one for appearance. Mrs. Henderson, the housekeeper, had made her lemon chicken for dinner, a simple meal she loved. For a few hours, it almost felt like a home. That feeling ended at exactly 9:07 p.m. Elena was in the upstairs library, putting her book back on its shelf, when the lights went out. Not a flicker, a total, plunging blackness. The hum of the refrigerator, the soft whir of the air conditioning, all of it stopped dead. The silence that followed was thick and absolute. It pressed against her eardrums. Then a sound, a distant crash. It came from somewhere downstairs. Not from the kitchen, from the direction of the formal living room, a room no one ever used. Her first thought, trained into her by 100 security briefings, was the panic room. It was behind a hidden panel in the master bedroom closet. A safe, silent cube lined with communication equipment and bottled water. That's where she was supposed to go. Mikhail's voice echoed in her head. Asterisk. You hear a strange noise. You don't play hero. You seal yourself in. You let the system work. Asterisk. But her feet didn't move toward the master suite. They carried her to the top of the main staircase. The moon was full outside, and its pale blue light filtered through the huge windows, painting ghostly stripes on the marble floor below. She saw nothing moving, heard nothing else. Another sound, a scrape of metal on stone. It came from her left, from the direction of the garage. The panic room was to her right. Down the hall, through the bedroom, into the closet. Safety. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. Her breath started coming in short, sharp little gasps that she tried to swallow. Without making a conscious decision, she turned left. She moved quickly, her bare feet silent on the cool runner carpet in the hallway. She wasn't running to something. She was running away from the empty, silent trap of the panic room. She pushed through the service door that led to the back staircase, a plain, narrow stairwell used by the staff. It was even darker here, just a faint glow from a small emergency exit sign at the bottom. She took the steps slowly, her hand trailing along the rough, painted wall for balance. Each step felt like a mile. At the bottom was a short hallway that led to the garage entrance, and, just before it, the security monitoring room. The door was slightly ajar. A soft, greenish glow spilled out into the dark hall. Her mouth went dry. She should turn around. Right now? But the glow was a beacon in the overwhelming dark. She crept forward and peered inside. Leo was there. He wasn't in his uniform jacket. He was in a simple black t-shirt, leaning over the bank of monitor screens. The screens were alive, powered by a backup battery. They showed 12 different black and white views of the property. The gates, the gardens, the empty living room where the crash had come from, the long driveway. He heard her. He didn't jump. He just slowly turned his head. His face in the green monitor light looked different. Older. More serious. He held a finger to his lips. She stepped into the small room. It smelled like electronics and dust. On the main screen, she saw a figure in a dark hoodie moving across the west lawn, then disappearing out of the frame. Her blood ran cold. Leo's hand was on the computer mouse. He was scrolling back through the footage from the living room camera. On the screen, she watched the figure, the same hooded person, walk calmly into the frame, look directly at the camera hidden in a smoke detector, and then sweep a large porcelain vase off a side table. The crash she had heard. It was deliberate. A performance. Then the footage showed something else. It showed her. It was timestamped just 3 minutes ago. It was a view from a camera in the main hallway upstairs. It showed her at the top of the stairs, hesitating, then turning left toward the service door instead of right toward the panic room. He had seen her disobey. He had seen her make the wrong choice. Her disobedience was right there, in crisp black and white. If Mikhail saw this, the thought was a bucket of ice water down her back. This wasn't just a security drill. It was a test. And she had failed. Leo's voice was so low she almost felt it more than heard it. They'll look here first. He meant Mikhail's security chief, a man named Dmitri, who reviewed all incident footage. Dmitri's cold eyes would see her hesitation. He would see her choice. He would report it. Without thinking, driven by a pure, sharp instinct for survival, Elena moved. She reached out and placed her hand over Leo's on the computer mouse. Her skin was icy. His was warm. She could feel the steady pulse in his wrist. She didn't look at him. She kept her eyes on the damning footage of herself on the screen. She applied a gentle, firm pressure downward with his hand still under hers. The cursor moved. She highlighted the last 30 seconds of the hallway footage and pressed the delete key. A dialog box popped up. Permanently delete selected clip? This action cannot be undone. She clicked yes. The image of her failed test vanished into digital nothingness. The timestamp on the monitor blinked from 21:10 to 21:11. A minute had passed. A minute that no longer existed. She finally let go of his hand and took a step back, her own hands trembling. What had she just done? She had just conspired with the driver to hide evidence from her own husband. It was a line she could never uncross. Leo didn't scold her. He didn't look surprised. He simply nodded once. Then he turned away from the monitors and walked to the back wall of the small room. He pressed his palm against a section of plain wood paneling, about shoulder height. There was a quiet click. A small, door-shaped section of the wall popped open an inch. It was a hidden entrance she never knew existed. He looked back at her. This way. Quickly. He held the door open. Beyond it was not another room, but the top of another, even narrower staircase, leading down into utter darkness. It was the old, original servants' stairs from when the house was built a century ago, long since sealed off. She hesitated for only a second. She had already burned the instruction manual. There was no point in stopping now. She ducked through the opening. He followed, pulling the panel shut behind them with a soft, final sigh. The darkness was complete. She heard him flick a lighter, and a small, wavering flame appeared, illuminating his face and the steep, narrow steps descending into the earth. "Watch your step," he murmured. They went down, the air getting cooler and smelling of damp stone and old wood. At the bottom, the lighter flame showed a small, stone-walled cellar. It was empty except for a few dusty wooden crates. On one wall, illuminated by the jumping flame, was a carving. It was small, about the size of her palm. It was an owl, its wings slightly spread, its eyes two careful circles. The sight of it stole the breath from Elena's lungs. Her mother had a necklace, a simple silver chain with a small, flat pendant of an owl. Elena remembered, with a clarity that hurt, tracing the shape of that owl with her small finger when she was a child, sitting on her mother's lap. Her mother had vanished when Elena was 8 years old. The story was that she had left, that she had chosen a new life, abandoning her daughter and her husband. Elena had been told this so many times, she had almost learned to believe it. And now, here was that same owl, carved into the wall of a secret passage in her husband's house, shown to her by the quiet driver. Leo didn't explain. He didn't say, "This is a symbol of the network that is watching over you," or "Your mother was part of this." He just stood there, holding the lighter up so she could see it. His silence was the loudest explanation of all. It told her that nothing about her life was what she had been told. Not her husband's business, not her mother's disappearance, and certainly not the purpose of the man named Leo who had been hired to drive the car. The realization was not a gentle understanding. It was a physical thing, a rearrangement of her entire world in the space of a few heartbeats. The safe, gilded prison she lived in was not just a prison. It was the center of a silent war, and she had been a prize locked in the middle of it. And Leo, he wasn't a warden or just a driver. He was the first person in 10 years who had shown her a way out. He blew out the lighter. In the perfect dark, he spoke, his voice a quiet anchor. The power will be back on soon. The intruder is gone. It was just a test. You need to go back to your room before the generators kick in. Go back the way we came. I'll wait here. She didn't know what to say. Thank you felt too small. Who are you? Felt too dangerous. So she just turned in the dark and felt her way back up the narrow stairs, her heart now beating with a new, strange rhythm. Not just fear, but a dawning, terrifying hope. She slipped back into the main house just as the lights flickered, hummed, and blazed back to life. The house was loud again with its normal sounds. Upstairs in her room, she sat on the edge of her bed, her mind racing. She looked at her own reflection in the dark window. The woman looking back was different. She had a secret. She had an ally. And she had the shape of an owl burned into her mind. The night's fear was fading, replaced by a single, burning question. If Leo was more than a driver, what had he really been hired to do? And more importantly, was he here to keep her in her cage, or was he here, finally, to help her find the key? The secret of the owl in the wall lived inside Elena like a second, silent heartbeat. For 3 days after the blackout, she moved through her normal routines: morning coffee in the sunroom, a walk in the walled garden, selecting menus with Mrs. Henderson. But her mind was somewhere else entirely. It was in that dark, cool cellar, tracing the shape of carved wings. Every time she saw Leo, which was only in brief, sanctioned moments when he opened a car door or stood by the garage, a silent communication passed between them. Just a glance, held a fraction of a second too long. It was enough. It was a thread of shared truth in a world of beautiful lies. Mikhail returned from Chicago on a Friday evening, October 4th. He brought back the cold air of the airport and a new, watchful tension. He didn't mention the security drill. He didn't ask if she was frightened. He simply observed her over dinner, his eyes like two polished stones, missing nothing. "You look tired, Dusha Moya," he said, slicing into his steak. The knife made a sharp sound on the fine china. "I didn't sleep well while you were away," she said, which was the truth. "The house is very quiet." "It is meant to be quiet," he replied. "It is a sanctuary." But it didn't feel like a sanctuary anymore. It felt like a glass box, and she was suddenly aware that someone was always watching. The next morning, her phone was gone from her bedside table. When she asked Mrs. Henderson about it, the older woman looked at the floor and mumbled something about a system update for all the household devices. The landline in her sitting room went dead. The sleek laptop she used to watch movies in the media room would no longer connect to the internet. She wasn't being punished. She was being isolated, cut off. Mikhail was pruning her world, leaf by leaf, until there was nothing left but him. By the following Tuesday, her world had shrunk to the west wing of the house. Mikhail told her, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, that there were security concerns in the rest of the property, some sensor malfunctions that needed fixing. For her own safety, she should stay in her rooms, the upstairs library, and the adjoining sunroom. Mrs. Henderson would bring her meals. It was temporary, of course. The doors to the main hall were not locked. But Dmitri, the security chief, or one of his serious-faced men, was always stationed just outside, reading a newspaper or checking a tablet. A friendly, silent sentinel. That's when the real silence began. It was a heavy, muffled silence, like being underwater. She could read, but the words swam on the page. She could watch the garden, but the colors seemed dull. The only thing that felt real was the memory of the owl and the feeling of Leo's warm hand under hers on the computer mouse. The mirror moment came on the third afternoon of her confinement. She was walking from the library to the sunroom, passing the long, gilded mirror that hung in the hallway. She caught her own reflection and stopped. She saw a woman in a soft, cashmere sweater and tailored pants. Her hair was perfectly smooth. A simple strand of pearls, a gift from Mikhail on their first anniversary, lay against her collarbone. She looked elegant. She looked cared for. She looked like a cherished possession, displayed on a velvet cushion. And in that moment, she didn't see a victim. She saw a collaborator. She had polished this image. She had learned the right words, the calm smile, the graceful way to accept a compliment or deflect a question. She had built this beautiful, hollow woman piece by piece, because it was easier than being broken. The cage wasn't just around her. She had helped decorate the bars. A hot wave of shame washed over her, so strong it made her dizzy. She leaned against the wall, the cool silk wallpaper doing nothing to calm the fire in her cheeks. Later that night, long after the house had settled into its usual quiet, she heard a soft noise at her bedroom door. Not a knock, a faint scratch, like a piece of paper being slid across wood. Her heart leapt into her throat. She waited a full minute, listening to the pounding of her own blood, before she crept to the door and opened it a crack. The hallway was empty, but on the deep pile carpet lay a single, folded square of plain white paper. She snatched it up and closed the door, her back pressed against it. Under the light of her bedside lamp, she unfolded it. The handwriting was neat, blocky, and unfamiliar. Asterisk East Service Gate. Code 8897. 2 a.m. Key under the stone dove, asterisk. That was all. No signature. No explanation. But she knew. It was from Leo. The key was literal. The stone dove was a small statue in the neglected rose garden near the east wall, a relic from a previous owner. She had seen it 100 times. He was giving her a way out. Tonight, a wild, soaring hope burst in her chest, so bright it was painful. Freedom. It was a word she had almost forgotten how to taste. She could pack a small bag. She could be at that gate at 2 a.m. He would be there. He would get her out. Then, the other thought came, cold and dark, dousing that hope like ice water. The security drill. The hooded figure. It wasn't just a test for her. It was a test of their security, Mikhail's security. If she disappeared, if Leo helped her, it wouldn't be a quiet thing. It would be a breach. A failure. A declaration of war between Mikhail's organization and whoever Leo worked for. The people with the owl symbol. How many people worked for Mikhail? Dozens? More? How many of them, like Dmitri, were just people doing a job? If she triggered a conflict by escaping, what would happen to them? What would happen to Mrs. Henderson, who had a granddaughter she talked about with shining eyes? What would happen to the quiet young man who tended the gardens? She sat on the edge of her bed, the note crumpling slightly in her trembling hand. The moonlight was slowly moving across her room, a silent, silver clock. It had been a square on her bedspread. Now it was a long rectangle on the polished wood floor, inching its way toward the wall. She was being offered her life back. But the price might be other people's safety, their peace, maybe even their lives. It was the same impossible choice she imagined her mother might have faced years ago. Stay and be safe in your prison. Or leave and start an earthquake. The weight of it pressed down on her, so heavy she could barely breathe. She held the imaginary key in her mind. It felt cold and sharp. She whispered the question into the empty, beautiful room, her voice barely a sigh. Whose blood for my life? The moon continued its slow crawl. 1 a.m. came and went. She hadn't packed a bag. She hadn't moved from the bed. She just sat, holding the note, watching the light change shape on the floor. She thought of her mother's laugh, a sound she hadn't heard in over 20 years. She thought of her mother's hands, how they always smelled like lavender and pencil lead. She thought of the story she'd been told her whole life, that her mother had chosen to leave her. And as she sat there, trapped not by locks but by the awful weight of choice, a new truth unfolded in her mind, calm and clear and terrible. It wasn't a sudden bang. It was a quiet click, like the hidden panel in the security room opening. Her mother hadn't run away from a bad marriage. That was the child's story, the cover story. Her mother had been extracted. She had been part of something bigger, something represented by that owl, and she had been in danger. The people who came for her had given her a choice, too. Come with us now, and your daughter becomes a target, a pawn, a weapon to be used against you forever. Or stay, and let us make it look like you abandoned her. Let her hate you, but let her be safe. Her mother had chosen to let her daughter believe a horrible lie, so that her daughter could live in a gilded, guarded cage, untouched by the war outside. And then Elena realized the story of her mother's disappearance was a lie. A protective, devastating, loving lie. The note in her hand was no longer just an offer of escape. It was the same offer, from the same people, a generation later. History was repeating itself, and she was standing in her mother's shoes, holding the same terrible key. The moonlight had reached the far wall. It was 1:45. She had 15 minutes to get to the east gate. She stood up, her legs stiff. The paper was damp with her sweat. She looked at the simple strand of pearls on her dresser, the symbol of her beautiful cage. The choice was now hers. Would she pay the same price her mother had? Would she stay, to keep the peace, to protect the innocent people in the orbit of this silent war? Or would she take the key, and in doing so, accept that her freedom might have a cost she could never repay? The house was utterly still, waiting for her answer. The clock on her bedside table clicked to 1:50 a.m. 10 minutes. The crumpled note in Elena's hand felt like it was burning a hole in her skin. She had spent the last hour in a frozen silence, caught between two terrible choices. But now, a strange calm settled over her. She realized she had been looking at it all wrong. This wasn't about choosing between her freedom and other people's safety. That was the old way of thinking, the way of a woman who believed she was only a decoration or a damsel in distress. She was neither. She stood up and walked to her closet. She didn't reach for a suitcase or a duffel bag. Instead, she chose her clothes with a new, clear purpose. She put on dark, comfortable trousers, a soft black sweater, and flat, sturdy shoes she used for gardening. She looked at the elegant dresses and silk blouses hanging in a row. They were costumes. She wasn't wearing a costume tonight. Then she did the most powerful thing she could think of. She sat down at her vanity. She looked at her reflection, the perfectly arranged hair, the subtle makeup from the day before. Slowly, deliberately, she picked up a hairbrush and brushed out the smooth style until her hair fell in its natural, simple waves. She took a tissue and wiped away the lipstick. The woman in the mirror looked younger. She looked real. For the first time in years, she looked like herself. Her silence, her obedience, her perfect smile. These were the only weapons she'd ever had. Tonight, she would use them. She left her bedroom at 2:05. She was late on purpose. She walked down the main hallway of the West Wing, her footsteps silent on the runner carpet. Dmitri was at his usual post in a chair near the grand staircase, reading something on a tablet. He looked up, his expression bored but alert. "I couldn't sleep, Dmitri," Elena said, letting her voice sound tired and a little annoyed, the way a privileged person might. "I'm going down to the kitchen to make some chamomile tea. The stuff Mrs. Henderson leaves in my room is stale." Dmitri hesitated for a second, then nodded. Making tea was within the rules of her confinement. "Of course, ma'am. Do you need assistance?" "No, thank you," she said, offering a faint, weary smile. "I know the way." She walked past him, down the stairs, her heart beating a steady, sure rhythm. She wasn't sneaking. She was walking in plain sight, using her role as the lady of the house as a shield. She went to the kitchen, filled the fancy copper kettle with water, and placed it on the stove. She made a show of clinking a cup and saucer. She let Dmitri hear the normal, domestic sounds. Then, while the kettle began its low whistle, she moved. She slipped out the kitchen side door into the pantry, then through the laundry room, and out a small, unmonitored delivery entrance that opened onto the east garden. The night air was cold and sharp, smelling of damp earth and fallen leaves. A heavy fog had rolled in from the river, clinging to the ground in milky patches. It hit her. She moved quickly, keeping to the shadows of the tall boxwood hedges. Her gardener's shoes were perfect, making no sound on the gravel path. The east service gate was a small, wrought iron door set into the high stone wall. It was used for deliveries and landscaping equipment. The electronic keypad beside it glowed with a soft, green light in the fog. Her hands were steady as she punched in the 4-digit code from the note, 8-8-9-7. There was a soft, electric click. The lock disengaged. She looked around. The statue of the stone dove was just to the left of the gate, nestled in a bed of overgrown ivy. She knelt, the cold, wet leaves soaking through the knees of her trousers. She felt under the base of the statue. Her fingers closed around a small, cold piece of metal. She pulled it out. It was a simple, old-fashioned skeleton key. At that moment, a figure separated itself from the deeper shadows by the wall. Leo. He wasn't in his driver's uniform. He wore dark jeans, a black jacket, and a look of intense focus. He held out his hand, not for the key, but to help her up. We have about 90 seconds before the gate lock reset triggers a non-alarm log entry, he said, his voice low and calm. You need to go straight down the service road. There's a car, a blue Honda, parked under the 3rd street lamp. The keys are in the visor. It will take you where you need to go. She stood, the key cold in her fist. You're not coming? He shook his head. If we both go, the response will be immediate and overwhelming. They'll lock down the county. If it's just you, and I stay to create a distraction, you have a real chance. I'll follow when I can. A distraction. She knew what that meant. He would make himself a target to draw attention away from her. Before she could say anything, a harsh, electronic siren hooped once from the main house, then fell silent. A system check? Or had Dmitri gone to check on the whistling kettle and found an empty kitchen? Leo's head snapped toward the sound. They're awake. It's now or never. He reached past her and pulled the heavy iron gate open. It swung inward with a low groan. Beyond it was a narrow, paved lane, disappearing into the fog. Freedom was a dark, open mouth. He looked back at her, and in his eyes, she saw no fear, only a fierce urgency. Run. Don't look back. He gave her a gentle push through the gateway. As she stumbled onto the service road, she turned. He was already pulling the gate shut, locking himself back inside the property, locking himself in with the waking danger. His plan was to get caught, to be the obvious puzzle for them to solve while she slipped away. The fog swallowed the shape of the wall and the house. She was alone on the quiet road. The 3rd street lamp was a hazy yellow ball in the distance. She could run toward it. She could take the car and disappear, just as he'd instructed. It was the smart choice, the safe choice. But as she stood there, the key biting into her palm, she thought of the owl carved in the cellar wall. She thought of her mother, who had left to protect her. She thought of Leo, who was now turning to walk back toward the main house, to offer himself up. A new feeling rose in her, hot and bright and decisive. She was done with people sacrificing themselves for her. She was done being the reason. She didn't run toward the street lamp. Instead, she ran along the outside of the wall, keeping to the damp grass, her eyes fixed ahead. She knew this property. She had walked every inch of the gardens. About 50 yards down, the old stone wall was lower, crumbled in one spot where a giant oak tree had grown against it for a century. It was why that section wasn't monitored by motion sensors. The tree's branches would set them off constantly. She reached the spot. The fog was thinner here. She could see the rough outline of the oak's massive trunk. She tucked the key deep into her pocket, grabbed at the rough bark, and found a foothold. She wasn't an athlete, but she was driven by a pure, clean fire. She pulled herself up, scraping her hands and her clothes, and hauled herself over the low section of the wall, dropping down onto the soft earth inside the property. She was back in. She could hear voices now, from the direction of the main house. Shouted commands. The beam of a powerful flashlight cut through the fog over by the garage. They were searching, but they were looking for someone fleeing outward. They weren't looking for someone who had just broken back in. She moved like a ghost through the familiar garden. She knew where every statue was, every bench, every dip in the land. She circled around toward the front of the house. And then she saw him. Leo was walking straight up the main driveway toward the front portico, his hands held slightly away from his body in a clear, non-threatening gesture. He was making himself visible. He was the distraction. A spotlight from the roof snapped on, its blinding white beams slicing through the fog like a knife. It swept the grounds, then landed, pinning him in its circle of light. He stopped walking. He didn't raise his hands. He just stood there, illuminated, waiting. Elena didn't stop to think. She broke from her cover and ran, not away from the light, but toward the man standing in it. Her shoes slapped softly on the wet cobblestones of the driveway. The spotlight was so bright it turned the world into a stark play of black and white. She ran until she was standing right beside him, inside the circle of light. She was breathing hard, fog puffing from her lips. She reached out and took his hand. His fingers were cold. He looked at her, his calm expression finally cracking into one of pure shock. "What are you doing?" he whispered, the words harsh with fear for her. She didn't answer. She just held his hand tighter and turned to face the house. The grand front door was opening. Mikhail stood silhouetted in the golden light from the foyer, Dmitri and two other men behind him. Elena lifted her chin. The spotlight was on them both, so bright it washed out everything else. She could no longer see the house, or the trees, or the gate. All she could see was the light, and the man whose hand she held, and the long, dark shadow they cast together on the driveway behind them. She had chosen. She hadn't run. She had come back. And now they were caught, together, in the blinding beam. The brass door handle was warm from the afternoon sun. Elena turned it and pushed open the chipped blue door, a little bell above her head jingling a soft, friendly sound. Sea air, salty and fresh, rushed in to greet her. It was the first day of May, and the small coastal town of Rockport, Maine, was waking up from its long winter. She stepped back into her little bookshop, the next chapter, her arms full of mail from the post office down the street. The shop smelled like old paper, fresh coffee from the little pot in the back, and the lemon-scented polish she used on the dark wood floors. Sunlight streamed through the front window, catching dust motes dancing in the air. It was quiet, just the distant cry of seagulls and the gentle tap of a loose shutter next door. It had been 2 years, 6 months, and 17 days since the night she stood in the blinding spotlight on Mikhail's driveway, holding Leo's hand. That night felt like a story about someone else now, a dramatic, black and white film. Her life now was in full color, and it was painted in the blues of the ocean, the greens of the pine trees outside her window, and the warm browns of thousands of book spines. She shuffled through the mail on the counter by her old brass cash register. Bills, a catalog for new bookmarks, a postcard from a regular customer who was vacationing in Italy, and then a plain white envelope with no return address. Her name and the shop's address were written in neat, blocky handwriting she hadn't seen in a very long time. Her heart did a quiet, familiar flip. Not fear, not anxiety, just a deep, resonant hum of memory. She slid her thumb under the flap and tore it open. Inside was a single, glossy photograph. No note. It was a picture of a weathered wooden bench in a park. Sunlight dappled through trees onto its slats. And there, carved neatly into the backrest of the bench, was an owl. Its wings were slightly spread, just like the one in the cellar wall, just like her mother's pendant. She turned the photograph over. On the back was a postmark. It was from Oslo, Norway. The date stamp was from just 5 days ago. She leaned against the counter, the photograph solid and real in her hand. The cool sea breeze from the still-open door played with a loose strand of her hair. She looked out at her quiet street, at the hydrangea bush she'd planted by the door the first week she'd arrived here. It had been a tiny, sad thing in a plastic pot. Now it was a huge, unruly ball of green leaves and tight blue buds, ready to burst into bloom. It needed pruning. She spoke aloud to the empty, sunlit shop, her voice calm and clear. "So you're alive." She didn't say his name. She didn't need to. The message was in the symbol, in the fact that he had reached out, and in the quiet safety of the distance. He was telling her he was okay. He was living his life, somewhere out in the wide world, and he was thinking of her. That was all. It was a hello, not a summons. That night on the driveway felt both a million miles away and as close as her own breath. After the spotlight had found them, everything had happened in a strange, slow-motion rush. There were no dramatic arrests, no shouted confrontations. Mikhail, standing in the doorway of his perfect house, had simply looked at the two of them standing together in the light, their hands clasped. He had seen not just an escaping wife and a traitorous driver, but a united front. He had seen a story he could not control. What happened next was a quiet negotiation, conducted in lawyers' offices and through secure channels she was never part of. The owl symbol, it turned out, represented a network far older and more powerful than Mikhail's operations. Elena's willingness to stand in the light, to refuse to run and hide, had given that network the leverage it needed. Her freedom, and Leo's, were part of a complex bargain, a ceasefire in a war she never fully understood. She was granted a new name, a new life, and a quiet distance. Leo was taken somewhere else, for his own safety and for hers. Their goodbye was a silent one, just a look across a sterile room before he was let out a different door. He had nodded once. She had nodded back. That was all. And then, she had started over. She tucked the photograph from Oslo into the pocket of her worn, flour-dusted apron. She walked back to the open door and took a deep breath of the clean, salty air. Then she picked up her pruning shears from the hook by the door. She walked over to the overgrown hydrangea, its leaves brushing against the blue paint of the shop wall. She examined the plant, her gardener's eye noting which stems were old and woody, which ones held the promising new buds. She didn't think about the past as she worked. She thought about the plant. She carefully selected a stem and made a clean, angled cut close to the base. The snip of the shears was a crisp, satisfying sound. She placed the cut stem on the growing pile beside her. She worked methodically, cutting away the old growth to make room for the new, to let in the light and air so the flowers could be their most beautiful. Her hands, which had once trembled holding a crystal glass of iced tea, were now steady and strong. They were marked with small, white scars, a nick from a box cutter while unpacking books, a burn from the oven when she'd first learned to bake her own bread, a scrape from a fall while hiking a rocky trail last autumn. They were the maps of a real, lived-in life. When she was done, the hydrangea looked smaller, more open. It looked ready. She gathered the pile of cuttings and carried them to the compost bin at the side of the little building. As she walked back, she saw Mrs. Henderson, not the housekeeper from McLean, but the elderly lady who ran the antique shop 2 doors down, waving from her porch. "Pruning day, Elena?" Mrs. Henderson called. "Yes." Making room for the big summer show, Elena called back, smiling. "Good for you, dear. Come by later for some iced tea." "I will." Elena went back inside, the bell jingling cheerfully behind her. She washed her hands at the small sink, the cool water feeling good. She looked around her shop. It was just one room, really, with shelves she had built herself with the help of a neighbor. There was a comfy armchair by the window for readers, and a small table where she served coffee on weekends. On the wall behind the counter, she had hung a single piece of art, a simple, framed pencil drawing of an owl in flight, given to her by a local artist in exchange for a stack of poetry books. It wasn't much, but it was hers. Every book, every scratch on the floor, every sunbeam on the dust. She took the photograph from her apron pocket and looked at it again. The owl on the bench in Oslo. It was a connection, a thread spun across an ocean, light but strong. It didn't pull her back. It just reminded her that her story was part of a bigger, wider world. It reminded her that courage wasn't about running away or fighting a dramatic battle. Sometimes, courage was simply planting a hydrangea by a new door and believing you would be there to see it bloom. She placed the photograph in the drawer of the old oak desk where she kept her ledgers and favorite pens. She didn't need to display it. She just needed to know it was there. The afternoon sun was moving lower, painting long, golden rectangles on the wood floor. She had a new shipment of books to unpack before closing time. She picked up her box cutter, sliced open the first cardboard box, and breathed in the wonderful, inky smell of new stories waiting to be told. Outside, the pruned hydrangea rustled gently in the sea breeze, holding the promise of 1,000 beautiful blue flowers soon to come.